Some of these machines look like a child glued a plane, a submarine, and a steam engine together and called it transportation. And yet every single one was real, built, funded, and sent screaming down actual railway lines. There were locomotives with propellers, jet engines ripped from bombers, cabs bolted on backwards, and one so enormous it couldn't fit around its own company's tracks. These aren't concept drawings. They ran. Here are 10 locomotives too strange to be real. Number 10. The Camelback. Picture a steam locomotive. The cab, where the crew stands, is at the back, behind the boiler, next to the fire. That's how it's been done for almost 200 years. Now imagine someone picked that cab up, dragged it forward, and dropped it right on top of the boiler, in the middle of the engine, like a saddle on a horse. That's a Camelback, also called a Mother Hubbard, and it's exactly as unsettling to operate as it sounds. Here's why anyone did this. The railroads of eastern Pennsylvania hauled anthracite coal, and mining left behind mountains of waste called culm, cheap, plentiful, and hard to burn. In 1877, John Wheaton designed an enormous, ultra-wide firebox that could burn that waste efficiently. But the firebox was so wide that a crewman standing behind it couldn't see a thing. So the engineer's cab was shoved forward, straddling the boiler, while the poor fireman was left standing at the very back, out in the open, shoveling coal and exposed to the weather. The design was genuinely dangerous. The engineer sat perched directly above the driving rods, and if one of those heavy steel rods snapped at speed, it could smash straight up into the cab. There are accounts of engineers being killed at the controls while the fireman, cut off at the back, kept stoking the fire, completely unaware. The two men could barely communicate at all. Nearly 3,000 of these things were built over about 50 years. Eventually, the danger caught up with the design, and new Camelback construction was effectively outlawed in the United States. Only around 5 survive today, including Central Railroad of New Jersey number 592, preserved at the B&O Railroad Museum in Baltimore. A locomotive designed around cheap garbage fuel with the driver riding on top of the engine. Number 9. The Double Fairlie. If you ever visit the Festiniog Railway in the mountains of North Wales, you'll see something that genuinely looks like a mistake. A steam locomotive with a chimney at both ends, a boiler that seems to face 2 directions at once, and the cab jammed in the center. It looks exactly like 2 locomotives were welded back to back and told to figure it out. That's a Double Fairlie, and it's one of the oldest strange machines on this list. The design was patented by a Scottish engineer named Robert Francis Fairlie, all the way back in 18. Fairlie was frustrated by ordinary locomotives. He thought they wasted weight on wheels that weren't powered, and on a tender full of coal and water that just sat there dead behind the engine, contributing nothing to pulling power. And he hated that a normal locomotive has a front and a back, meaning every time you reach the end of the line you need a turntable to spin it around. His answer was radical. Build a symmetrical locomotive with a boiler that's doubled up, joined in the middle, feeding 2 separate powered units, swiveling trucks with every single wheel driven. The crew stood in a central cab, the driver on one side and the fireman on the other, split by the firebox between them. Because both ends were identical, the thing could drive equally well in either direction. And because the wheels were mounted on pivoting bogies, it could snake around tight mountain curves that would derail a rigid engine. The Festiniog's first, little wonder, stunned engineers in 1870 by hauling loads that seemed impossible for its size. The design spread across the world, Mexico, New Zealand, Russia, and beyond. And here's the wild part. The Double Fairlie never really died. The Festiniog Railway still runs them today. Their workshops actually built a brand new one, named James Spooner, that entered service in 2023, more than 150 years after the original. A 2-headed Victorian steam engine, still working, still pulling tourists through the Welsh Slate Mountains. Number 8. The Beyer-Garratt. Most articulated locomotives are one long machine. The Beyer-Garratt did something no one expected. It took the boiler and slung it in the air, suspended in a cradle between 2 completely separate engine units, each with its own wheels, its own cylinders, its own fuel and water riding directly on top. The concept came from an engineer named Herbert William Garratt, and the design was built by the famous firm of Beyer, Peacock and Company in Manchester, England. The first one appeared in 1909, built for the railways of Tasmania. And once people saw what it could do, orders started pouring in from all over the planet. The genius of the design was in the geometry. On a normal big locomotive, the enormous boiler sits low and rigid, cramped between the wheels and limited by the width of the track. Garratt freed the boiler completely. With nothing underneath it but empty space, engineers could fit a huge, deep firebox and a short, fat, efficient boiler, a serious amount of power. Meanwhile, the weight of that machine was spread across two sets of wheels far apart, which meant a Garratt could run on lightweight, cheaply laid track. And because both engine units pivoted, this giant could bend around curves that would stop an ordinary engine cold. This made the Garratt the perfect answer for railways in mountainous, narrow-gauge countries. Over the design's lifetime, an astonishing 1,636 Garratts were built, running on 86 different railways across 48 countries. South Africa fell in love with them and operated the largest fleet in the world, including the GL class, which ranks among the largest and most powerful steam locomotives ever built on narrow-gauge track, hauling coal trains weighing as much as 2,000 tons through the hills. It's such a bizarre thing to see in motion. A boiler apparently floating between two engines, the whole articulated machine flexing like a living thing as it rounds a bend. It looks like it should fall apart. It didn't. It became one of the most successful articulated designs in the history of steam. Number 7. The Southern Pacific Cab Forward. This one looks so wrong that people who don't know trains often assume the photo is reversed. It's a massive articulated steam locomotive, and the cab, the crew compartment, is at the very front, ahead of the boiler. The smokestack is somewhere in the middle. The tender full of fuel is coupled behind. The whole thing appears to be driving backwards, and it was, on purpose. To understand why, you have to understand the Sierra Nevada mountains in California. The Southern Pacific Railroad had to drag heavy trains over Donner Pass, and that route was brutal. By the early 1900s, it ran through 39 tunnels and nearly 40 miles of snow sheds, long wooden tunnels built to keep snow off the track. With a normal locomotive, all the smoke and choking exhaust from the chimney would billow back over the cab inside those enclosed spaces. Crews were being nearly asphyxiated. In fact, some crews started solving it themselves by running their locomotives in reverse, pushing the tender ahead, just to keep the smoke behind them. The Southern Pacific took that desperate fix and made it official. Working with the Baldwin Locomotive Works, they built enormous articulated engines with the cab permanently mounted at the front. The crew now faced forward, in clean air, with a commanding view of the track ahead, while the smoke poured out behind them. There was one clever detail that made this possible. These locomotives burned oil, not coal. Bunker C fuel oil could simply be piped forward from the tender to the firebox. You could never do that with coal, which has to be physically shoveled. You can't pipe lumps of coal uphill through a locomotive. The oil is the whole reason the design worked. The Southern Pacific eventually built 256 of these cab forwards, the last and largest being the AC-12 class. Diesels ended their reign in the mid-1950s, and of all 256, exactly one survives, number 4210-94, the very last one ever built, now preserved at the California State Railroad Museum in Sacramento, a giant that spent its life looking like it was going the wrong way. Number 6. The Pennsylvania Railroad S1. Some machines fail because they're weak. This one failed because it was too magnificent. The Pennsylvania Railroad S1, nicknamed simply the Big Engine, is the longest reciprocating steam locomotive ever built, and it was so enormous that it couldn't actually fit around most of its own railroad. The S1 was completed at the railroad's Altoona shops around the end of 1938. Given the number 6100, it carried a wheel arrangement no other locomotive in history ever used, 6-4-4-6. It was what's called a duplex, two separate sets of cylinders and driving wheels, but mounted on one single rigid frame, not hinged like an articulated engine. Its driving wheels were a colossal 7 feet tall. Its streamlined Art Deco shell was styled by the legendary industrial designer Raymond Loewy, and from the tip of the engine to the back of the tender, it stretched over 140 feet, around 42 meters. That length was the problem. The S1 was so long and rigid that it physically could not negotiate the curves on most of the Pennsylvania Railroad's network. In its entire brief career, It was essentially restricted to one relatively straight stretch of main line between Chicago and Crestline, Ohio. A locomotive that magnificent confined to one route because the rest of the railroad literally bent too much for it. It made its grand debut as a showpiece. The S1 was the star attraction at the 1939 New York World's Fair, displayed with the lettering American Railroads on its tender. Just getting it there was an ordeal. It had to take a roundabout route, with obstacles temporarily removed and tight spots crept past at a crawl. At the fair itself, it was set on rollers so its giant wheels could spin under their own steam power, dazzling the crowds without going anywhere. It was fast. It reportedly topped 100 miles per hour more than once, but it suffered from constant wheel slip, and the railroad had already moved on to a smaller successor before the S1 even settled into service. Only one was ever built. It was retired in the mid-1940s, the greatest steam locomotive that was too grand for its own tracks. Number 5. The Union Pacific Big Blow. Imagine standing beside a railway line in Wyoming in the 1960s. Long before you see anything, you feel it, a rising, piercing shriek, like a jet airliner at full throttle, rolling across the plains from miles away. That's not a plane, that's a freight train. Specifically, it's a Union Pacific gas turbine locomotive, and the crews called it the Big Blow. These were, at heart, jet engines on rails. Instead of a diesel motor, a Big Blow used a gas turbine, the same basic type of engine that powers aircraft, spinning a generator that fed electricity to the wheels. Union Pacific ran the largest fleet of turbine locomotives of any railroad on Earth, and the final generation was the monster of them all. Each of these third-generation units produced 8,500 horsepower from a single prime mover, a record for a North American locomotive that has never been beaten. The railroad built them because it needed to haul gigantic, heavy freight trains across the mountains between Iowa and Utah, and a turbine delivered enormous power in one package. To keep costs down, they burned Bunker C, a heavy tar-like fuel oil so thick it had the consistency of molasses at room temperature. It had to be heated to around 200 degrees Fahrenheit just to flow into the turbine. And the noise. That's where the nickname came from. The turbine's exhaust roared out of vents on the roof at temperatures around 850 degrees Fahrenheit, blasting upward at high speed. These locomotives were so deafening that Union Pacific had to restrict where they could run. After a few appearances, some California cities essentially banned them for the sheer noise. So the Big Blows lived out their careers across the wide, empty stretches of Wyoming and Utah, where there were fewer people to complain. 30 of these 8,500 horsepower sets were built between the late 1950s and 1961, each one a three-part beast of a cab unit, a turbine unit, and a fuel tender. But turbines drink fuel, and rising oil prices and heavy maintenance costs doomed them. All were retired by 1970, and nearly every one was scrapped. Only 2 survive. The most powerful locomotives America ever built, too loud for the cities they were meant to serve. Number 4. The Soviet SVL. At the height of the Cold War, the space race got all the attention. But there was a quieter competition happening down on the ground, on the railways, and in 1970, the Soviet Union bolted jet engines to a passenger train and sent it screaming down the tracks. The machine was called the SVL, which translates roughly to High-Speed Laboratory Rail Car. Soviet engineers at the Kalinin Carriage Works, in the city now called Tver, started with an ordinary ER-22 electric rail car, the kind that normally trundled along on power from overhead wires. Then they did something no ordinary railway would ever consider. They took 2 AI-25 turbojet engines, the exact engines used on the Yak-40, a real Soviet passenger jet aircraft, and mounted them right on top of the rail car's roof at the front. To handle the speeds they were aiming for, the car was reshaped. Engineers fitted a streamlined nose and a tail cone to cut through the air, and they seriously reinforced the brakes because the machine had to cope with tremendous thrust the moment those engines lit up. They tested scale models in wind tunnels before committing to the full-size vehicle. The finished SVL rolled out on October 20th. It weighed over 50 tons and stretched about 28 meters long, carrying tons of jet fuel. And it flew. In tests, it reached around 250 kilometers per hour, roughly 160 miles per hour, faster than Japan's early bullet trains. On paper, the engineers had even hoped to push it toward 360 kilometers per hour, but that was considered too dangerous on conventional iron rails. The dream was to eventually pull a fast express service across the Soviet Union's vast distances. But the same flaw that killed America's jet trains killed this one. Jet engines are astonishingly thirsty. The fuel consumption made it wildly impractical, and the project was abandoned. For years afterward, the SVL simply rusted in a rail yard, a forgotten piece of Cold War ambition. Then, in 2008, it was finally honored. The nose section, jet engine and all, was cut off, repainted, and mounted on a pedestal outside the carriage works in Tver, where it still stands as a monument today. Number 3. The M497 Black Beetle. 4 years before the Soviets built their jet train, an American railroad did it first, and set a record that, incredibly, still stands to this day. By the mid-1960s, the New York Central Railroad was watching passengers abandon trains for cars and airplanes, and it was desperate to prove that trains could be genuinely fast. An engineer named Don Wetzel had a wild idea. What if you strapped jet engines to a rail car? In 1966, the railroad gave him the green light, and remarkably, just 30 days to make it happen. Wetzel's team took an ordinary Bud rail diesel car, a completely standard self-propelled passenger rail car, and mounted 2 surplus General Electric J47 jet engines on the roof, right at the front. These weren't just any jet engines, they were second-hand units that had originally served as boosters on the Convair B-36 Peacemaker, a gigantic Cold War intercontinental bomber. The whole project was done on the cheap, using existing parts, for around $35,000. The car needed to look the part, and here's a lovely detail. Wetzel's wife was a commercial artist, and she sketched out the placement of the jet pods and designed the sleek black and white paint scheme. That paint job, combined with the streamlined front, earned the machine its nickname, the Black Beetle. Then they took it out to a long, dead-straight, well-maintained stretch of track between Butler, Indiana, and Stryker, Ohio. On July 23, 1966, the Black Beetle was let loose. It hit 183.68 miles per hour, nearly 296 kilometers per hour. Wetzel later said the speedometer actually spiked toward 119.6 before he eased off. As a safety precaution, a small aircraft flew ahead to make sure the track was clear. That run set the American rail speed record on conventional track. And here's the astonishing thing. More than half a century later, despite everything modern rail has achieved, no train has officially beaten it. The Black Beetle was never meant for production. It was proof of a point. The jet engines were later repurposed as a snowblower, and the car itself was eventually scrapped in the 1980s, but its record lives on. Number 2. The Bennie railplane. In 1930, in a field just outside Glasgow, Scotland, there was a machine hanging from a rail in the sky, with a giant propeller spinning at each end, promising to whisk passengers between cities faster than anything on Earth. It looked like science fiction. It was very real, and it broke the man who built it. Its creator was George Bennie, a Scottish inventor who began dreaming up the idea in 1921 and patented it in 1923. He called it the railplane, and the concept was genuinely visionary. Instead of running on top of the ground, his sleek aircraft-like carriage would hang from an overhead rail, steadied by a guide rail below, and be driven by aircraft-style propellers, one on each end. His plan was to string these elevated tracks above existing conventional railway lines. Slow freight would rumble along on the ground, fast passengers would fly overhead in the railplane. He believed his cars could hit 120 miles per hour. To prove it, Bennie built a full test rig between 1929 and 1930 at Milngavie, near Glasgow, a 426-foot elevated track over an existing railway siding built by a firm that had actually constructed airships. The carriage itself was luxurious, fitted out to impress investors with plush seating and fine details. When it launched in July 1930, dignitaries from around the world came to ride it, and the response was genuine wonder. But there was a fatal flaw. The test track was tiny, just 426 feet. On that shorter stretch, the railplane could never actually reach the blistering speeds Bennie claimed. It could only manage a fraction of them. He couldn't fully prove the machine's promise, and without proof, the money never came. Bennie spent years and a personal fortune chasing backers around the globe. even proposing lines in the south of France and across the Middle East. Nothing materialized. In 1937, he was declared bankrupt. The railplane and its track sat rusting in that Scottish field, somehow surviving even the scrap drives of the Second World War, until they were finally sold for scrap in George Bennie died the following year, in obscurity. The man who built the future and couldn't sell it. Number 1. The Schienenzeppelin. And here it is, the machine that looks the least real of all. In 1931, Germany built a rail car shaped like a silver airship, made of aircraft aluminum, with an enormous wooden propeller mounted on the back, and it went faster than almost anything on rails for the next 20 years. It was called the Schienenzeppelin, the Rail Zeppelin, and it was the creation of Franz Kruckenberg, a German aircraft engineer who thought railways were doing everything wrong. He built his machine near Hanover, and it was finished in the autumn of 19. It borrowed everything from aviation. The streamlined body was built of lightweight aluminum in aircraft style, tapering to a point, looking uncannily like a Zeppelin airship laid on train tracks. Inside, it could seat around 40 passengers in a spare Bauhaus-designed interior, and at the rear sat a BMW aircraft engine driving a giant pusher propeller. The rail car was literally pushed down the tracks by an airplane propeller. On June 21, 1931, on the line between Berlin and Hamburg, the rail Zeppelin was opened up between the towns of Karstedt and Dergentin. It hit 230.2 kilometers per hour, about 143 miles per hour. That set a world railway speed record. And that record was so far ahead of its time that no other rail vehicle would surpass it until 1954, more than 2 decades later. But a spinning open propeller on a crowded railway is a nightmare. It was terrifyingly dangerous near station platforms and passengers, and it could fling loose stones from the trackbed. Because the propeller was fixed, the machine couldn't reverse on its own and needed to be turned around. It couldn't easily climb steep gradients because the airflow over the propeller broke down at full power, and it couldn't pull extra carriages. It was essentially a single vehicle, not a train. It was so alarming that no German insurance company would cover it. Coverage had to be arranged through Lloyd's of London. Only one was ever built. In 1939, with war looming, it was dismantled, its materials needed by the German army. A propeller-driven silver airship on train tracks that outran everything for 20 years, then vanished. Too strange to be real. Except it was. If you had to ride just one of these 10 down the track, which would it be? Tell me in the comments. And if this run was worth the ride, subscribe. There are stranger machines still out there.